I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, we made it to Friday. How about that? Welcome again to Call to Communion here on EWTN. This is the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. If you've got a question about the Catholic faith, please turn to us to get that question answered. And my personal recommendation on a Friday show, call early, because the phones very often get clogged up early in the hour, and we would love to get your question answered today. So here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're listening to us outside of North America, please dial the U.S. country code and then 205-271-2985. You can also send us an email if you would prefer to do that. We're going to get to an email in a moment here. And the address for that is ctc@ewtn.com. ctc@ewtn.com. The A-Team is ready to hear from you. Charles Beery is our producer. Matt Gabinski is our phone screener. Jeff Burson handles social media for us. If you want to ask a question via YouTube or Facebook, we are streaming there right now. Just put your question in the comments box, and Jeff will see it. He'll send it to us here in Studio One, and off we go. I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
Very well. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing decent, thank you.
Weekend plans for you?
Weekend plans. I might try to do a little writing if I can. I think I'm going to go watch a grammar school karate promotion too.
Well, that sounds exciting.
You know, belt test.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. We're going to go buy an elliptical. Been
for you.
talking about that for weeks, and now it's time to actually pull the trigger on that bad boy.
Fantastic.
All right, so this email from Mike in North Carolina is a little bit on the long side, but I think it's very important, so we're going to read it in its entirety. Mike says, I was one of 6 kids raised Catholic, the only one to refuse confirmation. At the time, it seemed unintelligible. I didn't want to pretend to profess the faith. Years later, I have returned to the church. My siblings, though, have all stopped practicing, except my sister, who is now an evangelical. I am amazed at how intelligible the faith really is and how poorly I was catechized. So, what is stopping my siblings from being Catholic is that they feel there are too many rules, that they are too outdated, in some cases even bigoted. Further, they don't see that they get anything from adhering to the faith that we all grew up in. I have been following my parents' example and not wheedling them to reconsider, not whining at them, but they do make known their disagreement with the teachings of the church that they call unloving. For example, sexuality, abortion. I try to manifest the love of God in my life, but they insist the faith itself is unloving. So I'm a bit stuck here. The sign that they would accept as proof of God's love is that I give up defending the faith. What do I do? Thanks, Mike in North Carolina.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I appreciate the question. Well, of course, you can't compel your relatives either to become Catholic. You can't even compel them to attempt empathy with your point of view, which would be a lower bar. You can't do any of that. You can't compel their will at all. All you can do is manifest grace and goodness and truth to them by the way that you live and the way that you treat them. Mm-hmm. Now, I'd like to say something about their specific complaints and about your own experience. People who say that they didn't understand the faith growing up or that were poorly catechized are many. I mean, their numbers are legion, right? I also think that if in your catechesis, the way you have been introduced to the faith as here are a set of rules or obligations that you have to maintain, then the question, what am I getting out of this, is a very good one, and the answer may be absolutely nothing. Yeah. Right? That's quite possible. So this, again, is a pastoral fault of the church, but not a fault of her doctrine or the efficacy of the sacraments. So let me really start with the kerygma, the proclamation of Jesus, what the Catholic faith ultimately is all about. At the heart and soul of the Catholic faith is the idea that God sent his Son to redeem us from sin so that we could actually live a new life, be changed into his likeness and image, be reformed into people who were both rational, free, and charitable. And so that transformation of the human person is what's ultimately in view. Now, the way to make the faith meaningful in your life is not simply to go through a set of rules or rituals, but rather to psychologically interiorize the meaning of the gospel, namely transformation in Christ. You know, the desire to be joined with him in his sufferings and his likeness of his resurrection, that I could live a new life, that I could put aside my passions and my vices, that I could become a more virtuous, more rational, and far more loving individual. And in doing so, participate in the very likeness and image of God, who is love itself. Now, the way that's effective in you is purposing to live the meaning of the gospel every day. Everything else in the Catholic Church is there only instrumentally to facilitate that interiorization. Like if the Church has a Mass obligation, the obligation is there so that I can learn how to accommodate myself to the meaning of the holy sacrifice of the Mass. If the Church, has rules about fasting, those rules are there only so that I can acquire the habit of abnegation. And when it comes to the moral issues of the Church, if the Church says, for example, don't fornicate, well, it's not there to be a killjoy. It's so that I can learn how to value other people and myself as something more than sexual objects. If the Church says don't commit abortion, it is because the Church would have me value human life from conception to natural death. So these things are not there to frustrate the natural ends or goods of the human person, certainly not their pleasures and even less their happiness, but rather to form us into these new creatures in Christ. Now, I grant to you, the way I have just shared the gospel with you is not the way that many people learned it in the Catholic Church growing up. They may have thought of the Church just as a set of arbitrary rules and dogmas that seem to have absolutely no connection to those questions of the interior life and the meaning of life. That, again, is a fault of catechesis, a fault of homiletics, perhaps, but not a fault of Christ or the Church that he founded.
Sounds like a good plan for Mike, though, to not be, berating his siblings and bothering them, bugging them all the time.
Well, sure. I have family members that are not Catholic. I would be joyful to share the Catholic faith with them, but my relationship with them is in no way contingent on trying to strong-arm them into the Catholic Church.
Yeah. Try to model that life, and that sounds like what Mike is doing, which is very, very honorable. Mike, thanks so much for your email. In a moment, we'll talk to Tom in Dallas, Michelle in Columbus, and there's a line for you at 833-288-EWTN for a call to communion with Dr. David Anders. Stay with us.
Church Pop takes a fresh and fun look at the news shaping our world, featuring engaging, inspiring, and informative Catholic social media content. Find it on Snapchat, Instagram, and on the web at churchpop.com. And you can get Church Pop emailed directly to your inbox. Visit EWTN.com and click subscribe. EWTN, the Global Catholic Network.
The most original and exclusive Catholic content is on EWTN Radio.
Hey, I'm Michael O'Neill, the Miracle Hunter. This week, Maria Morera Johnson discusses Our Lady of Charity from Cuba. Also, Lorenzo Petrarca, the great-nephew of Padre Domenico.
The Miracle Hunter with Michael O'Neill. Tomorrow afternoon, 1 Eastern, on EWTN Radio. EWTN, teaching the truth.
Not surprised to hear that your words of affirmation, you are so good at that. You find something nice to say to everybody that calls in. That is a real talent and a gift.
This particular show was a hook for me on EWTN. I was laid off for a while, and you guys were out there. And so if you want the truth, just dial into EWTN. I love it.
The Friday edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN, in progress just for you. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. Two lines open at the moment, 833-288-3986. Let me tell you about something that is beautiful and very holy, now available from EWTN's religious catalog, the Prayer to Our Lady of Good Health 3-day votive candle. This devotional candle, encased in a sturdy glass holder, is designed to burn for 3 days. A print of Our Lady of Good Health on the front and a prayer on the back that reads, Most Holy Virgin, venerated with the title of Our Lady of Good Health, Because in every age you have come to the assistance of the sick, we ask you to intercede for us, for those dear to us, and for all who are ill. Obtain for us health of mind and body, or at least strength to accept our sufferings in union with Christ our Redeemer. Amen. Fantastic. This candle is 8 inches high by 2 inches in diameter. It's made with odorless paraffin wax. And by the way, there's more than 15 designs from which to choose. Be sure to visit EWTNRC.com to view all these designs. And by the way, you will receive a discount when purchasing 3 or more candles, which are all designed exclusively for EWTN. Check it out. Take a look at what we're talking about here at EWTNRC.com. EWTNRC.com. All right, if you're ready now, let's go to Tom in Dallas, listening on, let's see here. Let me click the magic thing here. Sirius XM, channel 130. Tom, happy Friday to you. What's on your mind today, sir?
Same to you as well. Dr. Andrews, I've heard that the teaching of once saved, always saved, you're going to heaven, originated in Florida by a Protestant minister that specifically wanted to attract Catholics to that. Where did this originate? Is that true? I thought you might know. And how long has it been around that type of theology?
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate the question. So I'll give you a brief history of the Protestant doctrine of salvation, of which this is a part. Luther, as you know, in the 16th century, 1520s, articulated the doctrine that a man is saved, a person is saved by faith alone and not by works of the law, not by any kind of moral contribution on that individual's part. And the way Luther thought that happened was that when you have faith in Christ, God imputes Jesus' righteousness to you. So though you remain objectively sinful, God accounts you righteous. And that's the way Luther understood it. Now, John Calvin, is a generation after Luther, accepted Luther's position, but he added a few entailments, a few emphases that were implicit sometimes in Luther, but Calvin really drew them out. One of them is the idea of predestination. Luther also believed in predestination, but Calvin really highlighted it. And the idea here was that faith itself is a work of God's grace. One does not choose to have faith. One is just caused to believe by divine agency, and that along with faith and justification, God also regenerates the soul, causes the individual to be morally changed, become a new person, and that with regeneration also comes the gift of perseverance. This is Calvin's view, not the Catholic view, so that a person, God would just sovereignly elect, just choose an individual, cause them to be reborn, born again, cause them to have faith, cause them to be justified, and then guarantee that they would persevere until the end. So if you are elect, on Calvin's view, if you've had saving faith, if you had an experience of regeneration, you will necessarily persevere to the end and you will necessarily be saved. Okay, now, you say, well, that sounds a lot like once saved, always saved. It's really not. There's a key difference. There's a key difference. Here's the difference. Calvin recognized, as did his followers, many Calvinists recognized, that a person could have a kind of simulacrum of faith, what they would consider a kind of feigned faith. They might even be persuaded that they have faith. But if they shipwreck their faith, if they apostatize, if they veer off into gross immorality, that would just be evidence that they didn't have real, sincere, saving faith, and that what seemed to be regeneration was just psychological effluvia that vanished, right? So the doctrine of perseverance in Calvin's teaching did not allow for someone to live an immoral life, did not allow for the possibility of apostasy. And if somebody acted that way, they would just say, well, that guy didn't have real faith. But nevertheless, the notion got ensconced that with faith and regeneration, the truly elect would necessarily persevere and they would not fall away, right? Mm-hmm. That's different from the Catholic position. It's also different from the Lutheran position. Catholic position is you could have true faith, you could have regenerating faith, you could have the gift of the Spirit given to you, and yet you can voluntarily walk away and be lost. Calvin denied that. He said, if you had the real McCoy, you're never going to walk away, right? Now, very early on, 17th century, there were other Calvinists, particularly in Puritan New England, who said, yeah, you sound too Catholic. because what you're really doing is you're saying the way you know you're saved is that by the quality of your moral life. And you're trying to sneak morality back in, through the back door, so to speak, so that you don't really have assurance of salvation unless you're working and striving and working out your salvation with fear and trembling, and you won't really know till the end. And that seems pretty Catholic stuff to us.
Yeah.
So no. And Anne Hutchinson from Boston was famous for a position called antinomianism. There's a statue of Anne Hutchinson, Boston Commons. You can go see it today. And she said, no, it's just faith. It's just faith. Faith guarantees eternal salvation, regardless of the quality of your moral life going forward. So no need to adhere to the law. You're saved just in virtue of faith alone. Now, we're still not quite to so-called once saved, always saved. We're still not quite there. We're getting closer to it in 17th century Puritanism, because what's lacking is a theology of conversion as a kind of crisis moment, a sort of identifiable moment in your personal history associated with a decision to follow Christ, right? Because, see, the Reformed tradition up through the Puritans all would have accepted sacramental baptism as the rite of entrance into the church and into the Christian life. And if there was conversion, it was a psychological event that couldn't necessarily be plotted on a map the way that modern evangelicals do. In the Second Great Awakening, which comes in the 19th century, associated with characters like Charles Grandison Finney and Asa Mahan, they moved away from the predestinarianism of Calvin, the idea that God elects, towards the notion that man just chooses. They still maintained a belief in salvation by faith alone. But now they've gotten rid of the idea of the perseverance of the saints, and they've gotten rid of the idea of the bondage of the will, and they have just put the emphasis on the free choice of the will to decide to follow God. And that becomes, rather than baptism, that becomes in modern evangelicalism the key point, the hinge point that determines, are you in God's camp or are you not in God's camp? Now, when that theology hit the Calvinist or Reformed community, they combined that with the idea of perseverance, the idea that if you're truly saved, you're never going to be fallen away. And so what you have is a kind of bastardization or sort of adulteration of early Calvinism into this idea that you could equate salvation with a sort of singular crisis moment of personal conversion surrounding an individual decision, coming forward for the altar call, going forward at the Billy Graham crusade.
That's what Billy used to call the hour of decision.
Hour of decision, yeah. And that in that moment, one could have an infallible certainty of one's eternal life regardless of the future course of one's morality. So that idea really comes in, late 19th century. And then, of course, it's heavily popularized by a lot of the revivalist preachers, Billy Sunday, Billy Graham, these kinds of characters, D.L. Moody. And so it's really a sort of late 19th, early 20th century invention. But it has roots, deriving from early Calvinism. It's kind of a, sort of a deformation of the Calvinist doctrine of perseverance. Now, many of the folks that hold this today are Baptists that cringe at the name of Calvin and would be loath to admit that the origins of their doctrine are at root Calvinistic, combined with revivalism. But that's how it came about.
Do we know who actually coined that phrase?
Don't know who coined the phrase. Could very well have been some preacher in Florida, but the theology behind it is late 19th century.
Very good. Tom, thanks so much for your call. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Call to communion on this beautiful Friday afternoon here on EWTN. Let's go to Michelle now in Columbus, listening on the great St. Gabriel Radio. Michelle, what's on your mind today?
Hi. Yes. I was raised Catholic, went to Catholic schools, but probably for the last 30 years or so, I've really had no organized religion at all. And I think I just kind of thought, the rules and the regulations of the church and the guilt, if you miss Mass on Sunday, you're going to go straight to hell. I mean, I think I didn't want so much, so much restriction and so much fear. And I thought, God, he loves us all. He loves all of humanity. He sees your heart. He's forgiving. And so why would he punish me for something like that? And so I just kind of had my own little religion that, God's there for me. He loves me. He's not judging me. But there was something definitely missing in my life with just following my own head as to, what religion should be like. And so I started exploring different churches and found out that, a lot of them they just didn't fit some of their teachings and their beliefs. It just didn't seem like I could find any place to go that fit me. And so what really brought me back, I've got to tell you, is on your Now You Know Media, there was a book by Peter Huff. He's called World Religions 101. And I didn't know he was Catholic till the very end of the book, but he's a Catholic theologian at Benedictine University. And, he went through all the religions of the world, and ended up finally, with Catholicism. But what he said that really got me back is that, he went through, like Gandhi said, a friendly study of the religions of the world is a sacred duty. And then, Dr. Huff said that study's not enough. We need open dialogue, personal engagement, interfaith friendship. Those all represent aspects of the sacred duty, facing, us in the world. And so I thought, I'm going to start going to Mass. And I did, and I felt kind of at home right away because it hasn't changed much. In the 30 years I was away, it was, pretty much the same, although some of the words have changed, like Constantinople, whatever that is, whatever that word is in the prayer. But
sure.
Anyhow, I kept thinking I'm going to go to confession one of these days, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it. In fact, I thought, I'm excommunicated and I can't receive the sacrament, so confession's a sacrament, so maybe they won't even want to hear me. And one day, I don't know what happened, I always went like 30 minutes before Mass to pray and I just spontaneously got up and went into the confessional. And, I said, bless me, Father, for I've sinned. It's been 30 years since my last confession.
Wow.
And, he said, well, welcome back. And he said, what brought you back? And I told him pretty much what I had told you.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, I don't really want to be a member of a church that discriminates. I mean, we're all God's people, whether you're homosexual, whether you are, I just want acceptance, across the board. I mean, it's not like I can't mingle and have friends that are Lutheran. I can't mingle with
I think I can speak to that issue. I think I can speak to that issue a little bit. And I really appreciate this story. This is a magnificent story. I'm really glad you shared it. I want a couple things that I would like to address in the way you phrased it. I'm really sorry that you experienced this burden of guilt and this fear of hell and this notion of a judgmental and unloving God who would damn you for missing Mass. Because, as somebody who's been a professional apologist and theologian and student of the church for many years, I've never encountered the way you framed it as being the Catholic dogmatic position, right? And so that's certainly not how I have learned to experience God in the Catholic Church. I'm really sorry to hear that was the way you grew up, and that's very disheartening. I can totally relate and understand and empathize with your frustration. I'm also really sorry that somebody left you with the impression that you were excommunicated, because, in fact, you were not. You were never excommunicated from the church. You were a Catholic. From the church's point of view, you were just a Catholic who missed 30 years of Mass. That's not the same thing as being excommunicated.
Yep.
Very rarely does the church excommunicate anyone. Excommunication happens when the church, as a disciplinary procedure, says to somebody, you may not partake of the sacraments at all.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not what the church did in your case and doesn't do in your case. The very fact that the priest received you into the confessional is proof that you were not excommunicated. If you were, he wouldn't have been able to absolve you.
Yeah.
So, those kinds of understandings, that's very frustrating, and I can see why that would be so discouraging. I'm so glad that you found your way back to the confessional. And I'd like to say something about this business of God discriminating, or the church discriminating, and having rules and God loving everybody. So, of course, the Catholic position is God does love everybody and does not show favorites. I mean, St. Peter says, now I can see that from the Lord accepts those from every nation under heaven who fear him and do what is right, for God does not show favoritism. That's from the book of Acts. So I totally agree with that position. But let me ask you a question. Let me rather give you a kind of an illustration of how I see these issues. Let's say you have a fellow who the proverbial shipwrecked on a desert island kind of folks, and he stumbles across the Gospel of Mark. just the Gospel of Mark. It's like a tract that somebody's handed. He opens the Gospel of Mark, and he says, wow, this Jesus guy's pretty good stuff. And he makes an act of faith in Jesus as he finds him in the Gospel of Mark. Well, that was great. But wouldn't you want to hand him Matthew and Luke and John, too, if you could, and the Old Testament, the rest of the New Testament? Of course, you'd want him to have a more robust understanding of his relationship to God. And what if you could say, well, in addition to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we've got the Church Fathers. We have 2,000 years of reflection of wise people on the life of Christian faith. I'd like to invite you into a deeper, richer understanding of this God who loves everyone and desires it all to be saved. That's really the way I conceive of what the church has to offer. It is this God of love, but elaborated in this magnificent tradition.
Lots more straight ahead on Call to Communion here on EWTN.
There are a lot of ways to pray. When I was in the evangelical world, we didn't like rote prayers that the Catholics prayed. Nah, we wanted to say our own prayers. We thought that it was coming more from the heart. Any kind of prayer, whether it comes from the heart and is a loose connection of words, or it is a prayer that the church has had for centuries, is good because it is prayer.
And now, the EWTN Family Prayer with Father Joseph.
Family, a prayer that we pray together is a powerful prayer. So please pray together with me our EWTN Family Prayer. Today we pray for those in need of employment. Our provident Father in heaven, holy is your name. Many today are without employment and are struggling to provide for themselves and for their families. Give us this day our daily bread. Reveal your providential care and assist them in finding meaningful work. Bring them closer to you in this time of trial and show them the way. Let the door be open to them, for we are knocking. Let them receive your help, for we are asking. Amen.
Want to be notified when Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders goes live on Facebook? Follow EWTN Radio's Facebook page and click the bell icon to be notified.
Do you have a miracle story to share with the world?
You can do it Monday on Take 2 with Jerry and Debbie
on most of these EWTN stations.
And we now go back to Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
So, what's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? Let's talk about that here on EWTN's Call to Communion. We're going to go back to the phones right now and talk with John. John is in Central Florida, listening on the great Divine Mercy Radio. Hello, John. What's on your mind today, sir?
Hello, gentlemen. Dr. Anders, thank you so much for taking my call. So just in need of some advice. I'm a Catholic. My wife is Catholic. Mm-hmm. And to give you a very summarized backstory, we came from sort of humble beginnings, not a ton of money in a suburb in the Midwest, and got married in 2009 and moved down to Florida, started in an apartment with one vehicle and had a 5-year-old daughter at the time. From 2009 until 2019, I worked 2 jobs 7 days a week. Went from that apartment to a townhouse with 2 cars, and then to a beautiful 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house with a pool and all that good stuff for the kids, and added 3 boys. So we have 4 kids now.
Okay.
The reason I'm telling you this backstory is because the woman I married has changed. She was a stay-at-home mom until about 2019, like I said. At that time, I stopped working the 2 jobs. And for the past year, she opened up a business and went from zero to very lucrative, and basically has sort of shifted her disposition to a degree. She is extremely angry, resentful, upset on a day-to-day basis with me. Looks back on our history at the challenges and negativity, and not the fact that we climb so far together, and so many positives are just never even discussed. And so currently, Dr. Anders, I'm living in a day-to-day anxiety-filled, just I'm walking on eggshells. My house doesn't even feel like it's my own, with an extremely different person than I married. And for a year, I've been trying to kind of, win her graces back, and I've apologized like crazy. I just am at a point where I don't know appropriately and in the Catholic way how to move forward. I'll end the question with this. I talked to a priest, and the priest said, John, you're at the fork in the road. It's either got to get better or it's got to go the other way. And I've never could imagine it going the other way, but it's hard to even imagine tomorrow, because each day is more hurtful than the last. I'm just being attacked. And
John, I love you. I love you. I love you. And I hear you, buddy. I absolutely do. And believe it or not, I've kind of been there. And the story you're telling me is very common. It's a very common experience today with a lot of men. And I want you to know I love you. And to the extent that I can, I've got your back, and I really want to help you best I can. All right? And I want to tell you, first of all, you are not alone. And I'm not trying to push a book, but if you read my book, The Catholic Church Saved My Marriage, you'll see what I'm talking about. All right? You are not alone. I know where you're coming from. I have a couple things to say. All right? First of all, I am not going to tell you, maybe I'm reading between the lines here, but it sounds like that priest was putting a challenge to you to either fix your marriage or bail. Now, I may be reading more into that than he intended.
That's what it sounded like to me.
I'm never going to tell you to bail. I'm not going to tell you to bail. I'm not going to tell you to look at this like fix it or else, with the or else being bailing, right? I'm not going to do that. And the reason I'm not going to do that is a lot of reasons, but I'll give you one very practical reason, and that is your children. All right, there are a lot of reasons not to bail on your marriage, but you've got kids, and once you have children, your marriage is not about you. Mm-hmm. It's not about you from the moment you say I do, right? But it's always been in view of those kids. That's why you say I do. It's in view of those children. So it's not about you, and it's not about your happiness. It's not about my happiness, all right? It's about those children. So here's some advice that I have for you. First of all, what is the goal of the Christian life? And I don't mean to get to heaven. I mean, what's the process by which we get to heaven? And what I'm going to say here may surprise you, but it is the teaching of the Catholic Church, especially in the Doctrine of the Church, St. Thomas Aquinas. It is to lead a reasonable life. It's to lead a life in accord with the rule of right reason. Not to live a life of fantasy, not to live a life of caprice, not to lead a life of wistful longing, but a life aimed toward the reasonable good. And the prudent decision-making that is a component of the reasonable good means taking account of the concrete circumstances of your life as they stand today, mm-hmm. and saying, what is reasonable here? What's reasonable right here, right now, in these circumstances? What can I reasonably do to seek the good? And I think reasonably, the most rational thing that you can do right now is lower your expectations for intimacy immediately, right? So that you don't experience this conflict. You're not going to immediately be able to stop the barbs coming your way, right? But you can alter your perspective in such a way that when you don't have unfulfilled expectations, mm-hmm. the emotional cost associated with being verbally assaulted diminishes, and you're better able to weather the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. So I'd start with lower your expectations for the kind of intimacy that you think that your wife owes you, right? Because it doesn't matter what you think she owes you. She is going to deliver what she wants to, whether you want her to or not. All right, and so that's number one. The second thing is it's also rational, it's reasonable that you need to not internalize the abuse. Now, it sounds to me like you may be doing a halfway decent job of that, because you told me a narrative that, as you see it, you have done your job as a husband and a father and a provider, right? And so you believe that what she's saying to you is unwarranted, right? You're not internalizing it and owning it. You're not saying, I must be a terrible person. But I would say on that, continue not internalizing it. Do not let her statements about you constrain your judgment of your own self. Like, you may have things you need to work on, but like, she's not the person to tell you what to work on right now. Maybe a counselor, a therapist, a priest, somebody else that tells you what to work on, not in this abusive situation. There's got to be empathy there to really grow as a person. So don't internalize that abuse. And then here's the third thing I'm going to recommend that you do. And this is by far the hardest, but it is the most fruitful, all right? There are things that you can do without her help that will improve the intimacy of your marriage. And I'm talking about the emotional intimacy of your marriage, right? There are things that you can do without her participation, all on your own, that will improve your intimacy of your marriage. And there is something that you are doing. Maybe it's perfectly reasonable. There's something that you are doing or have done that provokes her. Now, maybe you have every right to do whatever this thing is that you're doing. And I'm not making a moral judgment. But something about you is provoking her, all right? So it may be completely unreasonable of her to be provoked. But if there are things that you have done that provoke her, there are things that you can do, whether she deserves it or not, that can mitigate that provocation. Now, there is a secular therapist, psychologist, relationship coach named David Burns that I am a fan of. He's not a Catholic, and he's not a Christian, and he doesn't share all of our morality. But when it comes to tools for relationship, I think he's got some good ones. I recommend his book, Feeling Good Together. And here are the principles that I think make good sense in light of Catholic morality. The first one is that when she assaults you, don't defend yourself. No, Jesus didn't defend himself. Don't defend yourself, but find something about the accusation that you can agree with. You don't have to agree with all of it, but rather than defending yourself or being confrontational, find some way to agree with the accusation. That is disarming. Somebody says, you're a completely lousy person and you absolutely fell down on the job. You're right. I fell down on the job. It's amazing how that will turn the emotional temperature in the room down. But it requires death to the ego to do that, right? Here's another thing. Empathy. And what I mean by empathy is very specific. Can you tell her what she thinks in a way she would affirm? Not in a mocking, derogatory way, but in a genuine, like, I want to know where you're coming from. Can you tell her what she thinks, and can you tell her what she feels in a way that she would affirm? So I think what you're telling me is that you believe I haven't done a good enough job at X. Am I reading you right? And that's really, you're very upset at me. You seem quite distressed that I haven't done a good enough job at X. That's empathy, all right? And look, there's truth in I agree with you when you say I haven't done a good enough job in X. I'm going to agree with something about the criticism.
Yeah.
Could you tell me more? I'd like to know more. This is the third thing, like going deeper, showing that you actually care about her point of view. Please tell me more about how I haven't done this right and how you're feeling. I really want to understand. A compliment. And I'm really pretty impressed with how you're doing a good job at that thing. Like, I've got something to learn from you here.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you speak about your own feelings and emotions, frame them in such a way that they cannot be construed by her as an attack. I'm really, really sad that I've hurt you so badly. Or maybe, I'll be honest with you, I'm really wrestling with, like, the temptation to anger here. because I'm so frustrated, but you're fine. So nothing you reveal about yourself is construed as an attack on her. In other words, everything about your demeanor is designed to not to provoke, to reach out, to show empathy, to disarm, to show respect, and it requires a scrupulous, sometimes gut-wrenching effort to keep my mouth shut when I want to say everything in the world but those kinds of things. Because it means, like, I've just been slighted. I've just been insulted. I've just been unappreciated. Everything that I've done for the last 20 years has gone unnoticed. Doggone it. She needs to hear about that. Well, yeah, you can have your say, but that will undo the good that I'm trying to suggest to you.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then finally, at some level, you have to be content, or at least willing, for her to make the decisions that she's going to make. Right? So if she chooses to live a life of resentment and bitterness and anger, and you have done everything that you can do, you've used these secrets of communication to be empathetic and to reach out, and you've done it consistently and you're committed to it, it becomes internalized in your way of relating, and she chooses to continue in that way of being, you just have to let her be that way and say, okay, my life is different than I thought it was. And I've changed my expectations of what intimacy looks like and what marriage looks like, and I'm going to reorient how I understand happiness.
John, God bless you, brother. And we're going to put this up on the podcast probably in the next hour or two. Charles will have it posted, and you can listen again to the various bullet points that David was laying out there. The address, EWTNradio.net. EWTNradio.net. Don't be a stranger. I'd love to hear from you again sometime, John. Appreciate your call. Hey, be sure to join us for EWTN's Bookmark with Doug Keck. That's coming up tomorrow afternoon, 4:30 p.m. Eastern, here on EWTN Radio. This week, Doug sits down with K.V. Turley and Fiorella de Maria to discuss This Thing of Darkness, their fascinating work of alternative fiction all about Bela Lugosi, the great actor. A gripping story of fantasy, chilling realities, and a clash between Hollywood horror and the horror of the world. Do check it out. EWTN Bookmark tomorrow afternoon, 4:30 p.m. Eastern, right here on EWTN Radio. Are you a Bela Lugosi fan?
Not particularly.
Not so much? He was in probably the worst movie ever made, Plan 9 from Outer Space. You should see that sometime. I could go into a big, long story about that movie. Very interesting. Let's go to Debbie now in Cincinnati, listening on the great Sacred Heart Radio. Hey, Debbie, what's on your mind today?
Well, I am a convert to Catholicism, and I have a younger brother, and him and I both came to the Lord, our personal journey to the Lord in different ways. He is right now. His belief is we don't have free will, and I'm trying to explain it to him, and I'm always being shut down. But how he thinks that, God would not give us free will because he wouldn't want us to experience sin. But we have, because we live in a fallen world, and he thinks you're either a follower of God and you're in the light, or you're a follower of Satan, and that there is no free will.
Yeah, sure. I appreciate the question. So a lot of it depends on what you take free will to mean. What do we mean by free will? And in Catholic philosophy, free will has been variously interpreted, but I'm partial to St. Thomas's interpretation, and it means simply that we are rational. Because we are rational, we have the power to rationally deliberate. If my dog is not rational. He's a creature of instinct, and if I place a bowl of dog food down, and I have like low calorie dog food and like extra yummy dog food, and I put it down, my dog is not going to deliberate. He's not going to rationally weigh the merits of low calorie, high fiber dog food versus the yummy high fat version.
Yeah.
He's just going to go by instinct to whatever feeds his craving the fastest and the most efficiently and the most sort of, juicily. And that's the way animals are. They just behave by instinct. They may, you may offer them two options and they randomly select one versus the other, but it's not as a result of rational deliberation. And in our case, we have that power of rational deliberation. I can evaluate, okay, well, I've got this thing and it tastes great, but this over here is more nutritious, and I'm drawn to this, but I'm going to rationally decide to go over here because it's better for me. And that rational deliberation is all we mean by free will. It's all that's necessary for there to be moral responsibility. Now, it is possible to reconcile free will with a certain form of determinism, namely the idea that our free will falls within the scope of God's providence, so that my free human choices are predetermined by God. That's conceivable as a Catholic to hold that. Lots of Catholic theologians have held that position, because Jesus says not a sparrow falls apart from the will of God. And that the Catechism says that God's predestinating grace includes the activity of our human freedom. So your brother's position that God grants the grace to some people to be with him. Catholics, plenty of Catholics like St. Augustine, St. Thomas, believed in a pretty strong doctrine of predestination, but they didn't think that invalidated the doctrine of human freedom. Because, see, when I rationally deliberate, and that's what makes me a moral agent, I can only deliberate about the truths to which I have access. I can only respond to the stimuli that are presented to me. Well, where do you think those stimuli and knowledge came from? Well, from within the scope of God's providential design of history. I mean, it's by God's providence that I was born in Birmingham, Alabama, instead of Southern California, or Sri Lanka, or Bengal, or wherever, right? So the circumstances of my life that form the context for my moral decision-making and may condition the way those choices are made, all that's beyond my control. That's consistent with the predestinarian view of God's election, and yet it doesn't take away my power to rationally deliberate.
Debbie, thank you so much for your call. Let's go to Thomas now in Knoxville, Tennessee, listening on iHeartRadio. Thomas, what's on your mind today, sir?
Hey, Dr. Anders. Thank you for taking my call, sir. I wanted to ask you about some changes after Vatican II, and I don't know if this is true or not. I heard it from another prominent Catholic voice, actually Dr. Taylor Marshall. I'm sure you are aware of him. And he said after Vatican II, they changed all 7 sacraments, including the Mass. And he posed a question. He's like, why was it necessary to change them? And I was like, I've never heard of that. I need to ask Dr. David Anders. So I wanted to ask you about that and see any input you may have on that, sir.
Yeah, sure. I appreciate the question. So the liturgy changed after the Second Vatican Council. The liturgy changed, and so, but not the essentials of the Mass, not the form and matter of the Mass, not the form and matter, I should say, of the sacraments. The form and matter is given to us by divine revelation. Mm-hmm. You read about it in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. It'll tell you, here's the form, here's the matter. It's been there for 2,000 years. But the embellishments in which the liturgy, which the sacraments are embedded, certainly did change, no doubt about that. The new rite of the Mass, so-called Novus Ordo rite, is different from the Tridentine Mass that was the Mass for 500 years in the Latin West. But, of course, the Tridentine Mass itself was a development, was not the Mass as it was said by Jesus. And there have been liturgies and liturgies and liturgies within Catholicism for 2,000 years. It's not like we had one liturgy everywhere throughout the world for 2,000 years and then suddenly there was the Second Vatican Council. No, liturgy's always been something that developed and changed from time to place and culture to culture. But the essential form and matter of the sacraments has not changed. Now, I'd like to say something about a boutique theological ideology called traditionalism. All right? The Catholic Church believes in the authority of sacred tradition. Tradition is everything that the Catholic Church does to hand on the deposit of faith down through the centuries. And the tradition that has been handed down is a living tradition, guided by a living magisterium. And all of sacred tradition is available to me. Here I am in the 21st century. Nothing stops me from studying the liturgy of the Council of Trent or the Fathers of the Church or the Doctors of the Church from the 12th century or the 10th century or the 2nd century. And I do, frequently, all the time. And I draw on the entire patrimony of Catholic tradition to inform my living of the faith, my understanding of the faith. And it enriches me and helps me to become a better Catholic. That is very different from the ideology called traditionalism. Traditionalism isolates some historical moment of the past and declares by fiat that form of Catholic life from that era or that culture or that time is normative for all times, and then construes problems in the church today as the result of having departed from some pristine ancient form of the faith. Now, traditionalism is a modern innovation and is an ideological position that often places itself really at odds with the mind of the Holy Church, which is guided by a living magisterium. So you will sometimes find among traditionalists an attitude of opposition to the Holy Father, for example, who sits on the seat of Peter and is the successor to St. Peter and is Christ's vicar on earth. So the definition of a Catholic is someone who is in union with the Pope, not someone who has ideologically isolated some ideal moment or so-called ideal moment from the past and made that the test or badge of Catholic orthodoxy to critique everybody else in the church. And so we are big fans of tradition, but not of traditionalism.
Okay. Very good. Thomas, thank you so much for your call. I think we have just enough time for this question from Daniel watching on YouTube. Daniel says, I'm Catholic, but I was wondering, why does the Catholic Church honor Mary? Because people keep asking me why Catholics do that.
Sure. So St. Paul says in the book of Romans that we should render to each one what is his due. Honor to whom honor, custom to whom custom, right? And even in civil society, we put up monuments in Washington, D.C. or the state capitol in honor of civil rights heroes or war heroes or the fathers of the country or so forth. I mean, we even stand and cheer when the football team comes on the field, right? We render honor to whom honor is due, and that's actually part of the virtue of justice. I mean, imagine if we didn't differentiate between heroes who had saved us and, you know, the run-of-the-mill person on the street who hasn't. I mean, it's only a matter of justice that we honor people who deserve honor. Look at all the folks that have turned out for Queen Elizabeth's funeral
I
and
know.
to honor her and her beautiful life, right? So if we would do that for Queen Elizabeth II or for Abe Lincoln or George Washington or Martin Luther King Jr., what honor do you think is due the Mother of God who consented to the plan of the Incarnation through whom all people are saved? So, I mean, I'm a big fan of Martin Luther King Jr. and George Washington. Fantastic fellows. I mean, the country I live in today that I'm so grateful for is the fruit of their work and labor and love, right? But it doesn't hold a candle to the Incarnation that came through Mary's fiat. And so we honor her as is her due.
It's fitting.
As is fitting, as is her due, as an act of justice.
Sure.
She's Mother of God.
That's where we gotta be. So Daniel, thanks so much for your question. It's a good reminder for things like this because non-Catholics ask about Mary all the time. But we are ready. You know, just as David has said many times, just roll that around in your mouth a couple times. Mother of God.
Mother of God, Mother of God, Mother of God.
Like the man says.
Aluminum.
Kind of a big deal. Dr. David Andrews, thank you and have a great weekend.
Thank you, Tom.
We hope everybody has a great weekend, and we'll see you again on Monday's edition of Call to Communion, God willing. That'll be at 2 p.m. Eastern right here on EWTN with an encore at 11 p.m. Eastern. Do check out the podcast anytime by going to EWTNradio.net. On behalf of our fantastic team, I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders. Hey, have a great weekend. We'll see you on Monday, hopefully, right on here on EWTN's Call to Communion. Have a great weekend and God bless.
I'm Jeanette DeMello, editor-in-chief of the National Catholic Register, and together with Matthew Bunce and I co-host Register Radio,